Hello, everyone. I'm Evelyn Hu DeHart. I'm a professor of history here at Brown University, and I welcome you to this wonderful program this afternoon at the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies. We have a very rich panel planned for you, discussing, I think, a very, very timely subject. But before I introduce the panelists and the program, I would like to introduce the director of the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies, Professor Patsy Lewis, who would like to say a few words to you. Patsy?
Thank you, Evelyn. I just wanted to say how pleased I am that we have María Inclán as our cohort visiting professor this semester, and to say that it's been a difficult time to take up the cohort fellowship. And we know it's not what we would have hoped from the engagement, but we really do hope that you still find it rewarding. And we are lucky to have you because you are bringing such rich programming to the center. Last year, we started exploring demonstrations and upsurges across the region, different countries last year. So it's great to have this panel here reflecting on earlier instances across Latin America. I also want to extend welcome to your colleagues, Sofia Donoso, Nicola Soma, and Federico Rossi. And I really look forward to this conversation. Thank you. And thank you for hosting.
Thank you, Patsy. Patsy was the acting or interim director last year, and now she has been appointed to a full term as director of the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies. So we will look forward to Patsy's leadership for many years to come. Thank you, Patsy.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Ellen, for helping us set this up. So we have a program today organized by Profesora María Inclán de Mexico. Profesora Inclán or María is our COGUT visiting scholar at the center. The COGUT is a wonderful fellowship, endowed fellowship that the center has to bring in scholars from throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So today, Maria is joined by three other colleagues, Professor Federico Rossi. Professor Rossi is a professor of the University of San Martin in Buenos Aires, where he is now, but he is a visiting scholar at the Institute, the Humboldt Center, the German Institute of Global and Area Studies in Hamburg. He will return there when this pandemic allows him to fly back to Germany, right? Profesora Inclán, I should say, is a professor usually in Mexico, but where she has a research appointment at a very well-known Mexican research center called CIDE, C-I-D-E. But she has also been a visiting professor in various US universities, including most recently Princeton University. Maria will lead off the panel discussion today because she and the other panelists here that Patsy just introduced, Professors Rossi of Argentina, Professor Donoso of Chile, and Professor Soma of Chile, the four of them have edited or are in the process of editing a book that Maria will introduce us to, and then furthermore talk about her own contribution to this volume. And then we will turn the discussion over to the other editors of this volume to add their comments to our discussion today. The discussion today has this very intriguing title, Surveying Protests in Latin American Capital Cities, a comparative study of protest participation in Buenos Aires, Santiago, and Mexico City. Professora Inclán, please.
Thank you, Evelyn, so much, and thank you, Patsy, for this very generous introduction. I am honored to be here as a COGOT visiting professor. I am in Providence, and certainly it's a very different sabbatical leave experience, but it has been very gratifying as the pandemic prevents us from having much face-to-face interaction, but gives me plenty of time to write, being secluded in my Providence apartment. So that's very nice. And I've been enjoying teaching the Brown students the course on researching social movements in Latin America. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I will now share the screen to present to you.
Maria, Ellen, did you, excuse me, Ellen, do you have Maria as a co-host? I cannot.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
Okay, good. So you can share screen then. Yes.
Yes, I can.
Good. Thank you.
So today I will present to you this project that together with Sofia and Federico Nicolas, we have been co-authoring. It's not that we are editing this book, we are writing this book, this project, on protest activity in Latin American capital cities. And so it's a comparison between protest participation trigger in these three different cities. So today I will walk you through the introduction to this project. What were the motivations for us to write this book on surveying protests in Latin America? I will present to you the outline of the book and some preliminary results of the initial chapters, the ones that I'm most involved in. I will discuss a little bit about the contributions that we see that this book will do, not only to Latin American social movements or the literature and social movements in general, but also Latin American politics. And from there, I will give the space to Federico, who will expand more on the theoretical contributions of the project. So the project, it's called the CCC Project. And this, the name comes from a project that Stefan Walgrave and Bert Klandermans envisioned in 2009. And they call it the Caught in the Act of Protest Contextualizing Contestation Project. And they saw the need to create a standardized data set on protest participation determinants, the motivations, the mobilizing, the dynamics of mobilization, and political attitudes of protest participants to be able to begin systematically studying this phenomenon across Europe. And so with a grant from the European Science Foundation, they were able to launch the project in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in the UK, under the leadership of Chris Roots and Maria Grasso and Claire Saunders, in Spain with Eva Anducia and Juan Manuel Sabucedo, in Sweden with Abby Peterson, in Switzerland, Marco Giugni, in Italy, Donatella Della Porta, and in the Czech Republic, Andrzej Cisar and Katerina Blawlikova. And so they designed this instrument, this questionnaire, to ask protest participants while they are participating. So that's why it's called contextualizing contestation, because you interview participants in situ while they are protesting. And they were able to collect information on 71 different protest events in 31 different European cities in these 8 countries. And so that gives over 14,000 observations in Europe. In 2011, Bert invited me to be part of the project. And so thanks to a grant from CIDE and from the University of California, Mex's initiative together with CONACYT, which is the Mexican equivalent of the NSF, I was able to gather information on 7 protest events from 2011 to 2013 that gave me a little bit more than 1,300 observations. Then Paul Almeida in 2014 was able to gain a grant from the University of California Pacific Rim project to bring the project to Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Honduras. And he applied the questionnaire to one Labor Day, May Day, demonstration in San Salvador, Tegucigalpa, and San Jose, with over 1,500 observations. And then Sofia, Nicolás, and Federico, who are here today, were able to gather funds from Fondesit to bring the project to Argentina and Chile and gather information on 4 protests in each of these 2 cities with over 1,900 observations. So as you can see, the project is growing. The data, it's very exciting, and it's giving us plenty of collaborating opportunities. And so from here, based on this data set on Mexico, Chile, and Argentina, we started figuring out that we were able to write a comparative study, given that these 3 countries were more, brought us more dimensions to compare across than going directly to compare with other European counterparts. So we got together and we started thinking whether or not we could find a profile for the Latin American protester. Or as the project suggests, if we are thinking about that contestation is contextualized, whether this protester is gonna be a more sophisticated individual and we cannot truly find a specific portrait of the Latin American protester. And for that, we needed to look at how people are mobilizing in our 3 countries or cities, and the particular political context in these 3 cases that will bring people to the streets. And then once we do this, then we were able to start comparing to protesting participants in Europe. The other reason that why we thought about making it first a comparison between our 3 cases was that we had to adjust the methodology of the project a little bit, and I will explain that in a sec. And so finally, we want to, with this study, what we want to be able to say is, what does protest activity in these 3 capital cities tell to the rest of the social movement society in the world? So how will the book look like? We are thinking that we could have 6 chapters. In the first one, we will present the argument of the book, which is if contestation is contextualized by the political context, we believe that the urban protests that we survey in this book speak about the unresolved issues of the 3 different transition processes, like a ruptura in Argentina, an elite pact with authoritarian legacies in Chile, and a protracted transition in Mexico that have brought over time issues that have not truly been resolved or addressed by these transition processes, which are redistribution issues in terms of labor rights and education reforms, human rights, and the inclusion of minorities. And we test these ideas by looking at the protesters' individual characteristics, their social demographics, their the ways in which they are mobilized, their motivations to participate, the issues in which they take part, which are the organizations that bring them to the streets, and finally, what is the relationship of all of this to institutional politics by looking into their political attitudes. In chapter 2, we look at who is protesting. So this will be the individual characteristics. We look, of course, at gender, education, and their self-identified socioeconomic status. Then we go into the motivations to participate. And so we named that chapter so far. I mean, this is all tentative now. The why, the blame, and the maybe solutions that these people express. So we ask them what were their motivations to be there, to whom do they attribute responsibility for the problem that they are demanding during protest events, and what are the solutions they suggest to the authorities. I will present to you today data on chapter 2 and chapter 3. Then I will briefly mention some of the preliminary results on chapter 4, which deal with the role of organizations and personal connections in protest mobilization, so how people are mobilized to be part of these events. Chapter 5 deals with the political connections, so the relationship between protesters and their mobilizing and political context. And finally, in the conclusion, we talk about the contributions that we foresee for our project. So I mentioned to you, I mentioned to you that we adjusted the methodology a little bit. So the CCC project, when it began in 2009, they thought about bringing a small group of researchers to the field, to the protest events, to conduct a short questionnaire, like a 10-question questionnaire. And then for the people that agreed to be interviewed, they handed out the longer questionnaire that included all the questions. And they asked them to fill it out and send it by mail. With that technique, they were able to get a 30% more or less response rate. But in the Latin American context, I thought that, I say I because I was the first one who applied the questionnaire in Mexico City. I thought that that wouldn't be possible, not only because of the lower response rate that we could have, but also because of the reliability of the postal service. And so I thought that it was better to conduct the whole questionnaire during the protest demonstration. And what I did for that is I trained a group of about 40 undergraduate students at CIDE to be surveyors and go with me to the different protest events that we cover, to interview demonstrators while they were protesting. And the same in Argentina and in Chile, they did more or less the same technique, even though I think their surveyors were not undergraduates. Is that correct, Federico? Mm-hmm. And so with this, we were able to get a higher response rate, between 60% or so. And these are the numbers that we were able to gain in the different mobilizing issues that we cover per country. So as I told you before, we covered a protest event on labor, and this was the May Day event in all 3 countries. The 1st of May, there is a traditional union demonstration. In the 3 countries, we also covered a human rights demonstration, which is also an annual commemoration of the atrocities of the dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and in the case of Mexico is the commemoration of the 1968 student movement and massacre. Then we covered in the 3 countries a demonstration conducted by students. And finally, in the 3 countries also, we were able to cover the LGBTQ plus Pride Day. So with this, we think that we cover the issues that I mentioned to you before, the social and educational redistribution issues, human rights, and inclusion of minorities as unresolved issues of the democratic transitions. So these are the surveys that we have for each of them. It's relatively comparable, but of course we will calibrate our results, our final results. So who is protesting? Who protests in Latin American cities? This protest events, we are very aware that they do not represent all the possible mobilizing issues that are happening in our countries or in the continent. That's why we are trying to contextualize them to capital cities, because these are protest events that have had to have a certain size for being comparable to other events in the CCC project, but also about the issues that they cover. So of course we cannot say that these motivations or dynamics of mobilization or political attitudes would be the same as those of people protesting together with the Zapatistas, for example, or the piqueteros in Argentina. But we do believe that our protest events do represent the mobilizing issues of protest activity in capital cities. We compare our data to other national surveys, and in comparison to LAPOP, we see that if we look at the LAPOP data, we'll see that Argentina seems to provide the best environment for women to protest, in the sense that it's more equal, the participation of men and women in protest events. Mexico, in comparison, is the worst. So more, we have a clearer difference between more men participating in protest events than women. This, of course, remember, to the time frame that we are studying. I don't think, I mean, we will have to see what would be the proportion of women protesting in today's events in Mexico City, as we are seeing the feminist movement increasing in the city and in the country. And Chile stands in the middle. In terms of resourcefulness, we see that the Chilean protesters will be more eliticized or resourceful in terms of education and class identification, as well as occupation, than those in Mexico and Argentina. And then finally, in Buenos Aires and Santiago, protest participants appear to be younger than in Mexico. This is what LAPOP says. But when we compare those data to what the CCC project says, we see some difference, but not very drastic. Yes, in Argentina or in Buenos Aires, we will see that the participation of, oh, this is age. Oh, okay. Well, I will go into gender in a little bit. So in terms of age, we see that, yes, younger participants are more present in Chile than Argentina, than in Mexico, but the difference is not that drastic, because the second group in protesting in Mexico is not that they are very old, I mean, much older participants. It's just the people that will be in in the more productive, their more productive years. In terms of issues, if we look at who is participating in which events, we will see that, yes, of course, in terms of education, we will see that younger people would take part in those events, as well as in the LGBT day. And it, in terms of age, it corresponds that older people will go more to the labor and the human rights events. In terms of sex, we see, as I told you, as I wanted to tell you before, that yes, in Argentina, we see the comparison between women and men more equilibrated than in Chile or in Mexico, right? In Mexico, we see starker differences. At least in those years, women were not as active as men in protest activity. Sex by protest issue, we see that in labor, men will be more likely to take part in those events. But in all the others, we see that the participation of women and men will be more equal, except for LGBTQ plus Pride Day. In terms of educational level, yes, Chile presents a more elitized protest sector than Argentina and then Mexico, but at least I can tell you that the data from Mexico, when we compare it to the LAPOP data, is not that different from what the average level of education is for the entire population. So we are pretty confident that these results, even though they don't have representability at the national level, they are close to those. So the people that are participating present some of the characteristics that the average population in the country will have. And in that sense, our data is comparable, we believe. In terms of issues, we see that, of course, the people participating in education protest events will be more educated. The people protesting in or taking part in labor issues will be more within the high school level. And then we see their LGBT and human rights being more or less equal. Class. We see that there is a tendency in Chile and Argentina for the protesters to say that they belong to the working class. And not so much in Mexico. We'll see in Mexico that people, the protesting participants will say that will locate themselves between the lower middle class and working class. So those are some of the differences that we need to explain in comparison to LAPOP data or other national surveys. By issue, we will see this is the distribution of the social status of the participants. So it makes sense that people taking part in labor issues will identify themselves more with the working class. Then comes human rights in the same way. And then LGBT and education will have a different pattern. Okay. So those are the characteristics, like how do our protest participants look like? And so when we ask them about why they were taking part in these events, or how do they make sense of their participation, the questions were, why are you protesting? Who is to blame? And what do you suggest to do? And the results for these three questions are the following. In terms of motivation by city, we see that most of the people would say that they are there to support the movement or to support the cause that they are demanding. So that tells us that people are relatively informed about protest events. Then come their identification of social right demands, right? And the commemoration. So commemorating memory issues is still something prevalent among Latin American protesters or the city dwellers. So that's why we see the legacy of the transition processes and of the previous authoritarian regimes. And that is something that these people would have very present. But then they also identify the protection of their civil liberties and the need to protest against the government. That is more interesting to see that Mexican protesters are directing their protest more against the government than the Argentine and Chilean protesters. We also found it interesting that more Mexican protesters go to protest event for curiosity purposes, like to check it out or to have fun, they will say. Also interesting is the fact that Mexico protesting participants, especially during the labor event, they will say that they were there because they were obligated to do so. And that was not present in the other two cases. Motivations by protest issue. Again, support for the movement is the main category, but we will see that that is more prevalent for the LGBT movement, as well as the student movement. But labor and human rights will be fairly comparable as well. Commemoration makes sense that it will go to the commemoration of the violation of human rights, right? And the other commemorating event that will be labor. Social rights pick up among laborists and students, and civil liberties, the defense of civil liberties, again, it makes sense that it will be distributed among LGBT participants as well as human rights. When they attribute blame, it's interesting to notice that most of the blame is attributed to policies and legislation. So problems on how policy is designed and legislation is passed. Then come government problems. So they attributed the blame to different government actors. Commemoration is still, again, very important, even though the question was, who do you attribute blame for this? And commemoration still would be an answer that they will present again. And then systemic problems, this refer as we need to change the capitalist system or the neoliberal system. And so we group those answers as systemic problems that they identify. Repression is still an issue, but we will see that that is has very lower numbers in comparison to the other blame attributions. In terms of, if we look at the attributions by issue, again, we see that protesting participants are well informed, as participants in the education demonstration will attribute those blames to government or policy issues, while participants in the LGBTQ demonstration will attribute that either to legislation or to systemic problems, that the problem is more in society and needs to be changed. They will address. Human rights go along the commemoration, the repression, of course, and government problems. And labor, again, it's either identifying problems in the policy process or the government. Being commemoration still a present answer, as I told you before. So what were the solutions? So by case, people tended to mention more that they needed to be changes in government. Sometimes they were even suggesting like everybody should leave. But in other cases, they will address or identify specific actors. Then come also changes, structural or cultural changes. So we need to change the entire system. And then policy changes, and what was really surprising to me and also exciting to see is that they will see as a solution the need for organizing and mobilizing more. And that was present in all cases. And another interesting thing is to see that recurring or addressing the need for revolutionary or violent change or radical change has decreased in these three cases significantly. So we used to consider that protest activity in the continent was this more revolutionary in nature, and we see that that has faded away. And that we believe is also another issue or consequent legacy of the democratic transition processes in the three cases. Okay, so in chapter 4, we look at the organizational ties of all of this, and we see how all of this where all of this comes from, or how were people brought to the protest events. We look at who activated them, or whether those were personal ties or whether these were organizational ties. And we see that by case in Buenos Aires is more a traditional organic mobilization. So organizations will have a larger role in bringing people to protest events. And in Santiago and Mexico City, we see that people tend to rely more on personal networks or online media. By protesting issue, we will see our results suggest that this more traditional organic mobilization is concentrated around labor, and the other three issues will rely more on online media and personal networks. So the personal networks is family, friends, peers, and colleagues, or acquaintances that let them know about the event or even invited them to come by. The results in chapter 5, we look at the connection of contentious and conventional politics. So how are people politically embedded or detached from politics? And we see that in Buenos Aires, we will see that protest participation tends to be more politically embedded. That means that people would express a higher interest in politics, more political experience, not only in protest activity, but in other forms of political organizations and participation. They will have a higher sense of political efficacy and would be more satisfied with the functioning of their democratic system. In comparison, Mexico presents the opposite end of the spectrum, that people tend to be least engaged in politics, but this is relative. We will see in the book, we will talk about that the difference, it is there, but it's not that drastic. And Santiago protest participants will be in the middle. So, and they will be closest to the left end of the ideological spectrum. So we will see that they will pull their political ideology in that direction in comparison to those in Buenos Aires and Mexico City. The distribution of these issues across protesting issue, we see that laborists will be more attached to politics, but with a lower sense of political efficacy. And LGBTQ plus participants will be more diverse in their political ideology, but also less interested in politics. However, they would say that they are most satisfied. And those are very intriguing results if we think about their motivations to protest, mentioning that we need systemic change or address particular policies, right? So in conclusion, we think about that. We'll present the summary of the arguments of the different chapters. We'll talk about the transition types and the legacy on this on social movement organizations. And then we believe we will be able to offer some comparison to our other book projects that our European colleagues have already published. Marco Girni and Maria Grasso last year published a book on protest politics and activism in Europe, and Abby Peterson and her colleagues in Sweden compared all the pride parades and LGBT movements and the protest participation triggers. And so we think that our book will join this growing literature. And so I forgot to mention, but if anybody in the audience would like to see our book proposal in more detail, we are very willing and very welcoming of comments. So if you send me an email here over chat or to my Brown account email, we will be very glad to share with you our document. And now I will give the space to Federico, so he can.
May I interrupt you a little bit, Maria?
Yes, please.
Before we pass to Federico, if I may. First of all, thank you so much. This gives us a wonderful glimpse into how a book is conceived and planned and executed. But because Professor Soma says he has to leave, Federico, would you mind if I ask Professor Soma if he wants to add something to the presentation of Maria, because you will be leaving us in about 10 minutes. Professor Soma, would you like to add something? You have about, take a few minutes.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. That's fine. Thanks. Federico can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. You don't want to, she did such a good job. You have nothing to add, right? Okay. Now we pass to Professor Federico Rossi, who I understand, Professor Rossi, that you will talk to us briefly about the theoretical framework of this book, correct? The theoretical framing of this work, right?
Yes, I will add some details about the discussions that are in the book and mostly the argument and proposal of the book.
Yes.
So, as you could see, the structure that we propose for this book goes through different crucial questions that are who, why, how, what, no? The typical questions in social movement studies, and that we answer them through these surveys that we did that are following a method that was developed in Europe and that is structured around these questions too. So that's why also Maria suggested that we will do a comparison in the last chapter with the European findings, because we follow the same survey, strategy, methodology with some different little differences, that's the one that Maria mentioned. So following this methodology, when we were faced with the Latin American context, we found something interesting and partially different also from the European cases, that is the fact that we focus our research on the capital cities. And we did it because it's where there is a connection of several dimensions of life in Latin America, because these societies, even though our cases are 2 federal countries and 1 centralized country, they are the 3 cases, the capital cities, the places where are condensed and concentrated the political, economic, symbolic, and cultural dimensions of these countries. That doesn't mean that there's nothing happening outside the capital cities at all, no? But that this specific context, this specific particularity of the context where we are doing our, we did our surveys and we are proposing in our book, has a need to be theorized and added to the argumentation, no? We cannot say that what is happening in these capital cities is what is happening in the whole country at all, and we don't propose that. And there's a huge literature in Latin American social movement studies dealing with the spatial dimension, territorial struggles, the distance from the state, and we follow these kind of approaches and we agree with them. And because of that, we argue that there is a specific important difference in the fact that these people are protesting in the capital city. So with a proximity to the ministries, to the parliament, to the different political, economic institutions of the country. So because of this, these protests that we survey do not follow the same characteristics as other very relevant processes as the ones that Maria also mentioned. Zapatismo in Mexico, that is in a peripheric area, no? In the south of Mexico, or the Mapuches in the south of Chile and Argentina, or anti-extractivism dynamics that are concentrated in non-urban areas, obviously because of the characteristics of extractivism. So because of this, we found that in these cities, there is a tendency of these dimensions that we study that are labor issues, identity issues, redistribution, recognition, issues are not necessarily universal and national by themselves, but because of happening these protests in the capital cities, they are universalized or they are nationalized. No, that means that there is a particularity, that is that the local and the national become condensed in these places, and the characteristics of national dynamics and local dynamics are unified in some sense, not because they are like that per se, and not because in other parts of the countries, these countries, dynamics that are happening cannot be potentially national, or because that doesn't mean either that in these cities, what is happening at the local level is automatically national. But what we found is that through studying these individuals in our surveys, these people tend to do protests with a national understanding of their dynamics. So their interlocutors are the national government and their different ministries and areas of the government. And at the same time, they tend to present the claims as rights, as national rights that can be claimed in the constitution or through legal reforms or policy making, or universal rights, which are not automatically like that, obviously, no? But are understood in this way, and we found this as an interesting dynamic that if we want to understand the particularities of protesting in capital cities and not in any kind of city, no? This is not a study of urban politics, that is important. Even though it's urban, the dimension of this protest is not urban politics, but it's this politics in the capital city. That is a different dynamics from any other kind of city. So in this sense, what we found is an interesting combination of literatures coming from spatial debates of proximity and distance of the state, also different discussions about state formation, federal, centralized, and different kind of dimensions of the state, and also dynamics that are linked to social movement studies, no? That are also linked to debates that are linked to urban social movements that are connected to this protest, but also to dynamics that tend to be considered as unique, or not unique, sorry, as the only one that is happening in a country, and we can, in this way, show that there is a specificity in these spaces that need to be understood. Being said this, what we also do is, because we found that there's this connection of national and local dynamics at these capital cities, is to connect our argument to certain specific transformations that happen in the three countries in different ways, but the three has these kind of transformations that are national, that is the transformation and the intensity and depth of neoliberal market reforms, the intensity in the modification of the interest intermediation regime from neo-cooperativism to territorialism, and the type of democratization process that happen in each country, no? Elite paths, protracted transition, rupture, etc. These are national dynamics, no? So these are dynamics that happen in the whole country as such, but they are dynamics that, because of happening in these highly concentrated countries, are debated by the elites at the national level, are in reforms that are discussed in the Ministry of Economy, that is in the capital city and are also contested in the streets in the capital cities. Not that it's not contested outside the cities. No, we know that town revolts and several big disruptive processes happen first in the periphery and then in the core. But the core of the country tends to have a specific connection with these national dynamics. And we found that is interesting to connect the debate of these three literatures that are in democratization studies, political economy studies, and comparative politics with social movement dynamics and our surveys in order to understand the questions that Maria presented through the structure of the book. These questions of who they are, why they protest, how they connect with politics, etc. These transformations that happen across these three countries also are part of the explanation of these specific ways of protesting that we find in the capital cities. So part of the contribution is also in the connection of these literatures that are very well developed in Latin American studies with a literature that is connected to the type of methodology that we apply in surveying of protest that is mostly European based. And because of this, obviously is not considered in these three dimensions as we consider them, because originally was developed in Europe and it was thinking in a more European context with different kind of processes. For example, and going again to the importance of the capital cities, in Europe, these surveys were not done in the capital cities exclusively and was not a criteria for the selection of where to do the surveys, because except countries like France, they are not all highly centralized countries like Latin America. So this creates a different type of dynamic that is part also of the findings of the book.
Great. Thank you. Very good, Federico. Professor Rossi. Professor Donoso, would you like to add a few words before I open the floor for questions? Now, for all the participants, there is a button at the bottom of your screen, says Q&A. I'm afraid that given this format, I cannot invite you to stand up and come to the front of the panelists and give your questions to them in person. So would you kindly then use a Q&A button and type your questions, which then I will present to the panelists. Do you see that, all of you? Okay. So Professor Donoso, would you like to add a few more words to your colleagues' remarks?
Yeah, maybe just shortly. I mean, I think an additional contribution of the book is to unpack the notion of the Latin American protester. I mean, as many of you know that have dealt with Latin American politics, it tends to be like an idealized notion and image of the Latin American protester. And what we see comparing the people that actually go to street manifestation in these three countries is that their motivations, their socioeconomic characteristics, and also their relationship to the political system are actually quite different. And if you think about a survey as somehow as a photo, right, of a moment, what we try to do in the book more broadly is to connect, those features of the protesters. I mean, their motivations, their relationship with the political system, the organizational drivers behind their participation. We try to connect all of that with the contextual characteristics of each of the countries, and we found really interesting things when comparing the three countries. I mean, for instance, in Chile, where we had a pacted transition to democracy, and where civil society was pretty much demobilized during a great part of the 90s, we see that the role of organizations, for instance, is much less important than in the case of Argentina, and so on and so forth. So while the survey in itself is a photo, what we're trying to do is to, and Maria mentioned it in her presentation, what we're trying to do is to kind of connect that photo of those protesters, who they are, with broader contextual characteristics of each of the three countries. And there's the challenge of the comparison, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure some of those issues will come up in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the Q&A is open now, so please, please don't be shy. We're never going to get these four scholars together again here on our Zoom. Great. Okay, here is a question. But before I do that, Maria invited you to email her if you want a written copy of her presentation, a paper. Now, her email at Brown is Maria, M-A-R-I-A _ Inclán, I-N-C-L-A-N, @brown.edu. Okay. All right, this is a question from Yvette Hernandez. She says, hello, everyone. Many thanks, Maria, for your interesting presentation. In your presentation, you categorize LGBTQ groups' grievances as a main concern for youth, but it was presented as separated from human rights category. How you are addressing ontological, epistemological, political analysis and discussion of the definition of human rights and LGBT rights. Okay. Can you all hear, participants, if Maria speaks her answer? Ellen?
I think they can now.
They can,
muted.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, please unmute them because it's too much for her to type her answer. Please, Maria.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Yvette, for your question. And I agree with you that LGBTQ rights should be considered human rights. However, these were two different protesting events because of the context in which they were organized. So LGBTQ, it's, as you know, is the commemoration of Pride Day, which usually happens during the month of June in different countries. In Mexico, tends to be at the beginning of June. I don't know if in Argentina and Chile when they organize that. And the other, what we defined as human rights category is this commemoration of the violation of human rights during dictatorship. So LGBTQ rights are not directly linked to dictatorships or democracy regimes, while the human rights protest events that we have in this survey is basically a commemoration of the demands of those movements during authoritarian regime, and the human rights violations or still debts that current democratic regimes have to these aggrieved groups in the population. So that would be the difference. We encountered this question that you are mentioning, the same where we were defining between students and labor, because in all three cases, in many cases, the labor unions will support students and vice versa. However, we went to by who are the organizers of each event. I hope that answers your question.
Yvette, if you hear me, please, if you have a follow-up, you can type in a follow-up question and hopefully we'll be able to get back to you, okay? Now let me move to the next question. The next question is from Omar Coronel. Omar says, this is an awesome project and a great contribution to the literature, congrats. My question is, which would you think would be the main difference with the profile of the new conservative protesters in the region? Now, of course, you know, all three of the panelists can join in to the answer, okay? Did you all hear the question? Yeah.
Yeah, I will defer to Federico or Nicolas or whoever wants to join.
Nicolas has left us, unfortunately, but we have Federico.
So there is one, the question is great. The issue that we face is empirical. We did this project, these surveys in the three countries between 2011 and 2017. And so there was not these waves at some tiny beginning of this in Argentina, but not specifically as we are facing these protests, because these are massive protests. No? And so are outside our surveys. But there's an issue that is important in the theoretical discussion of social movement studies that is crucial, that is that most of these theories were developed and still are mostly applied to progressive movements. And we are faced with this issue of also studying other kind of movements. And I don't see any particular methodological impossibility of applying these surveys to these other protests. They can be perfectly applied. We simply didn't do it because we are not there. And second, theoretically, there are issues that can be considered, and some others would certainly need to be reconsidered for this kind of other kind of protests. Not specifically, I think, the issue and the argument of our book. I don't think that is put into question because of seeing progressive or conservative movements. But yes, other crucial conceptual discussions in social movement studies, that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Maria, Sophia, do you
yeah.
want to add to that?
Yeah, in terms of the differences, I mean, I would not like to venture into the unknown, but it will certainly be interesting to see whether they differ in terms of their education level, or the gender, or to which socioeconomic status do they identify with. As I say, I would not like to leave this in recording, my projections to the future, but it will certainly, if we had now the funding, it would be very interesting to get that data.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sophia? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as Federico was saying, there's some sort of like structural limitation to our data, right? Because
yes,
as part of a broader project, we kind of chose the issues that were being covered in the other countries on the one hand. So yeah, so that's clearly a limitation. And as Maria said, I mean, we've had recent developments in all three countries that, you know, really would motivate us to study conservative groups. I mean, here in Chile, we are in the middle of a constituent process during which, you know, conservative groups have been politically activated and demonstrate on the streets, you know, on a weekly basis. So that's a fascinating round to cover. But I think that's another research project.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you have been following our presidential campaign, you will know that our current president has elevated right-wing.
I think we social movement scholars need to start, you know, studying conservative groups.
Yeah.
We tend to study, you know, progressive left-wing groups, and
and maybe even the term conservative need to be problematized, because right-wing doesn't necessarily mean conservative anymore. Well, let's move on. We got some more good questions. Marcelo Velasco. Marcelo says, this will be great data. Will you also look at subnational protests to see if there is a difference in the why and who? This might be important in the bigger, less centralized countries. Maria, Federico, Sophia?
Well, we located our project in the capital cities because that's where we were located. But our European counterparts conducted the survey not only in their capital cities. In Europe, it was more spread out to other cities in each of these countries. So I guess, I mean, subnational cities are already subnational, but if you think about smaller cities, I can tell you that a student of Stefan Walgrave did his dissertation, and I was part of his committee, did his dissertation on protest activity of the smaller events in Mexico City. So those that happen, those that Federico was saying that we don't cover. And so he did the smaller protests that happened in the outskirts of the city, and he found similar patterns of protesting actors than the ones that we have. So that also gives us some confidence that this study is generalizable, and it's also representative, might be representative of other events.
Yeah. Federico, Sophia? No? Okay, let's move to the next question. This question comes from Kamala Kempadu. Dr. Kempadu, hello, Kamala. She is our second COGUT fellow. Right now, she's not in Providence, but she will be joining us next semester. Kamala Kempadu's question. Thanks for this work, a great presentation. Thinking about the BLM movement, you know that, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, BLM movement, and the focus on racism internationally. I am wondering whether ethnicity or racism are important dimensions to consider in thinking about protest movements, social transformation globally or in Latin America.
Certainly, and at least in Mexico, we, I don't know if it is with the geographical proximity to the US, but we saw some of the contagious effect of this type of protest happening in Mexico City. However, it was ephemeral, unfortunately. And probably because of the pandemic, also probably because the current developments in the country is focusing the attention of people on other type of protests going on right now. The feminist movement is taking off, and movements against the cancellation of social rights or prerogatives are going on. And so we don't see that, but it would be interesting because if the data set already includes some of anti-racist protests in Europe that were even present even before, like between 2009 and 2014. So that will certainly be interesting to study if these events continue to happen in the continent.
Great. How about in Argentina and Chile?
In the case of Chile, I mean, for those who are not like familiar with the recent year we had, we did not only have the pandemic, but we also actually had a massive protest wave from October onwards. And one of the interesting things I was mentioning that, you know, the features of our civil society here in Chile, how demobilized it was, and how, you know, far away civil society organizations were from political parties. And one of the interesting things during those months of protest that we had during last year and the beginning of this year was that while there were a complete absence of you know, signs and any, you know, recognition of political parties in the protest, we did have the Mapuche, our indigenous community flag was present in every, you know, manifestation. It was everywhere. And the whole, you know, the discussion about the constitution that we currently having in Chile, we're having a plebiscite in about 3 weeks here in Chile. It's one of the issues that is going to be discussed there is about the role that our Mapuche community will have, you know, in the constitution, what sort of rights they will finally have, you know. And I think it's one of the elements that is there is most consensus about, you know, within the center left here in Chile. We have like a huge depth, right, to our indigenous community, which has been, you know, structurally excluded for centuries, basically. And so yes, so that's a central part of the discussion that we're having here in Chile too. It takes another dimension, but it's similar to what is happening in the US.
The Mapuche is quite mobilized, it sounds like.
They're quite
Sophia.
mobilized, but they do not mobilize in the capital city. You know, they mobilize in the south. So it's somehow less visible, if you want. But nonetheless, it has gathered a lot of support from the center left. And as I said, during the manifestations from October 2019 onwards, it was really stunning to see. I mean, there were Mapuche flags everywhere, really. So yeah, it's very present in current discussions here.
Yeah. Federico, even if it's outside the book that you are all writing, is race an issue that is expressed, or?
In Argentina is non yet highly politicized issue. Is still denied the ethnic question, and there's a double myth of an empty land filled by white migrants, and so still is not accepted the ethnic question as existent beyond this romanticized idea of white migrants arriving to the country. That is true, that was a massive migration of Europeans. But beyond that, there is some even more massive or more contemporary migration intra-Latin America, and exists a small, in comparative terms to the Andean countries and other countries, indigenous population, but still is present. The Mapuches also are highly mobilized, less than in Chile, but highly mobilized, learning from the Chileans, clearly. And they are mobilized in other parts, but not in this type of reconnecting with the book. In the specific dynamics of the capital city, they are totally absent. We had originally in the Argentinian-Chilean project the idea of covering also an indigenous protest in Buenos Aires and Santiago, and we tried to do it, but there was none. And because there was none, we simply needed to accept reality.
Yeah, but Maria, Profesora Inclán just published a book in 2018 with Oxford on the Zapatista movement. So surely race is an issue in Mexico. Would you just maybe share with us a little bit? I know it's not one of your survey questions in your book, but.
Yes, I mean, and little by little, it has been picking up as an issue. Little by little, Mexican has become more aware of the racism that prevails among Mexican society, not only against the Black population, the Mexican Black population, which tends to be more invisibilized, but of course against indigenous groups in the country. And so not in terms of protest, but there are several issues that have already been highlighting that being indigenous sets you in a completely different handicap category to attain higher levels of education, access to quality services, public services, as well as better positions within the socioeconomic status. So it's something that is growing, but as I said, we only started seeing anti-racist protests now this summer together with the ones that we saw in the month of June of the Black Lives Matter here. But as I said, they were ephemeral. They have not continued over the months, unfortunately.
You know, there is
another question.
No, that's Marcelo saying thank you.
No, but in
that's
the chat.
Tempado.
No, Patsy.
I don't see it. Oh, here we go. Yvette.
Yeah.
Yvette?
No. Patsy in the chat.
Oh, somebody put it in chat. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
They're supposed to put the question. Sorry. Patty. Okay, Patsy put her question in the chat. Okay, Patsy.
I put because I
We
cannot.
were looking at the Q&A for the
No,
questions, but that's good.
But I
Okay.
can't access a Q&A because I'm registered as a different type of participant.
Oh, so, okay.
You may read it from the chat.
Yeah, shall I read it, Patsy, or do you
Yes.
want to, since you're, okay.
You can read it, thanks.
Okay,
Right.
Patsy says to all the panelists, am I correct to assume that some of the protests you explore are annual events, carefully curated, rather than spontaneous protests? What are some of the methodological challenges in covering the latter, that is a spontaneous? Would challenges be there in comparing the two types of protests? Can you consider some of the events you cover, for example, May Day, as protest or as commemoration? Good question.
Well, we did cover other more spontaneous events. The thing is that they were not issues that we could compare across cases. But in the Mexican case, during the years that we applied the questionnaire, it was the beginning of Peña Nieto's administration, and we saw a lot of contention there. We saw people protesting against the energy reform. The students were protesting against his campaign. Then we covered also another protest of the teachers protesting against the educational reform. And in Argentina and Chile, they also cover other more so-called spontaneous, I like to call them reactive events, because they don't come out spontaneously, but they are reactions to policy changes or particular political events. And you have to plan, you have to be able, especially in my case, bringing students as surveyors, the events have to be held during weekends, and they had to have a certain size. And so you had to consider those, but we had enough time to organize and be able to attend the events. And we had pretty much the same response. I published a paper on that with Paul Almeida on reactive and ritual events in Latin American politics and society. So you can see that that it's possible to do that.
Federico, Sophia? Do you have something to add, Sophia?
Yeah, it's in great part a matter of logistics, right? Because I mean, to organize one of these surveys is actually, it's a lot of work in terms of gathering all the surveyors and so on and so forth. So you kind of need some time to organize that. That's why these commemorations are quite suitable to actually apply the survey. We did last year during the social protest here in Chile, some students at my university organized a survey and applied the CCC methodology too. And while it was quite messy in the sense that you didn't have any parameters, so you didn't know how many people would actually show up. And that actually means that it's difficult to plan how many surveyors you need to cover, the different areas of the manifestation. They did, manage to compile some, quite a few surveys. But it's a matter of a logistical, question, and it will be of course really interesting to have infinite funding and infinite, human resources to actually cover and to be able to react quickly, and to cover also more reactive manifestation, as Maria was saying.
Very good.
Yes, I would like to add only two other things. In the case of Argentina and Chile, we also have the student protests that are not commemorative ones, are reactions to specific policies. The labor ones are a mix of both things, and the human rights are mostly commemorative. But because redistributed conflicts, human rights conflicts, are not commemorations of past successful policies, are partially commemorative in the sense that they have, like the 11th September and 24 March in Argentina and Chile, a specific day, but they are redefining the present time, and so they are discussing specific human rights policies of the present. Then there is, and then going back to the methodological issue, part of the contribution of this network, not only this book, is that it's not only the survey that was developed specifically for surveying in protest, but also a specific way of sampling inside protest. So it's a whole a specific way of sampling, depending if the protest is a mobilization in a street, or if there is a speaker and public, or there is a sort of activity around some movement of people without marching, or there are several ways of locating people in the specific place where they are protesting, and a specific way of sampling that you need some minimum knowledge of the past of these protests in order to anticipate how they tend to develop. So knowing a little bit that they go through this street, they tend to stop here, they tend to have here a speaker of this sector, then a speaker of that sector that comes from that avenue, and these kind of events that have a certain, like the LGTB protest, that they have, they march with their trucks and they dance, and so you have some things that you know that they will happen in a certain way. That allows you to apply this specific methodology with more rigorosity, and the sampling doing it better and having better results. So that forces us a little bit to some certainty in a context where the levels of certainty are low. For example, in the Chilean surveys, they always needed to finish before because of repression and run. In Argentina, in one case, and not because of police repression, but because of internal fightings among trade union sectors. So you are full of uncertainties, or sometimes they discuss inside the protest, and a sector decides to turn and go in another way. And so, but you have some minimum knowledge of, as Sofia said, how many surveys you need, where you will wait for them, how they will come, and then, well, you need to be flexible. So it's a complex way of surveying, and part of the book will include a methodological extended section at the end where we will explain all this, because it's also interesting for replication.
Great, great. Well, our time is almost up, and we have managed to go through all the questions. So very, very, very good timing, everyone, and good time management. So in the last 2 minutes, I have a question I would ask all of you, but just for quick answers, okay? Tell me one thing that surprised you from your data. You know, Maria, you presented so much data, all the graphs, the participation, the age group, the gender. You know, you must have had, before you examined the data and plotted the data and everything, you must have had some expectations just based on previous experience, personal and academic. So could I go around and you think of one thing that surprised you about your data that you can share with us?
Should I go first? Or?
Yeah, Maria, I'm just going to go around the room. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first I was surprised about how open people were to take part in the study. I thought that protest participants will be more reticent or more paranoid about why we were conducting the survey. And that was something, a very nice surprise to see, that they were very open and actually they like to be surveyed. And the other, in terms of data, I thought that I was gonna find more, how can I say? There was this stereotypical view in the country, constructed by the media and the regime as well, that protest participants tended to be these citizens that tended to be bought off by the organizations to take part and were not informed. And I was very, very gladly surprised that no, even in the Mexican case, even if we compare it to Argentina or Chile that are more informed and more resourceful, Mexican protesters were informed people, aware of their political context, and interested in taking part in political activity. And that, to me, was a nice surprise, because then we can start forgetting about the differences between the global North and the global South, at least in terms of protest participation, because people participate because they care everywhere, whatever the issue it is. So that was nice.
Great, wonderful. Federico?
I was surprised by two things in the data of Argentina. No? That is the issue that there was a sort of dilution of the more transformative dimensions of historical Latin America protesting, meaning revolutionary, radical transformation, not in the way of protesting, but in the type of claim, no? And that even in the most left-wing protests, most of them are with a direct connection to a specific policy or to a specific claims that are linked to something that exists in the current political system, meaning a double thing, no? Not necessarily that there is like a defeat of other ways of doing politics, neither an acceptance of the rules of the game, but that there is a change there. And so the second interesting surprise that is linked to that is the very high degree of institutional and attachment of protesters. So that questions most of the literature that puts protesters as outsiders, challenging the insiders of the state. And there is an enormous connection between both. And we published with the Chilean team a comparison on that, on the LGTB. Wow. And was an interesting also.
Wonderful. Sophia, you get the last word.
Okay, well, maybe, I don't know if it surprised me that much, but I think one of the most interesting findings of the Chilean data has to do with the role of organizations. And, I briefly, referred to the weakening of civil society in Chile, and it's fascinating to see it reflected in how actually people organize in Chile, and the diminished role of organizations, even though we've had our organizational rebuilding, if you want. A lot of new organizations, feminist organizations have been hugely influential in the last years. Of course, the student organization, environmental organizations, but this has been like a rebuilding a little bit from scratch, if you want, because they were so severely, co-opted and demobilized during the first years of democracy. And it's fascinating to see that reflected, when you ask the protesters, how they actually, were informed about the manifestation, who invited them to be part of the manifestation, so on and so forth, the whole trajectory to actually arrive at the manifestation. You really see that organizations play a minor role. Nevertheless, people go out on the streets, right? We've had like several protest waves, and we've had this massive protests during the last years with more than 1 million people on the streets. So people do go out and manifest, their discontent. But so that leaves, of course, a really important question, which is, if these people are not being organized by specific organizations, and they don't have like a representative body, right? Like they're like somehow some atoms, how do we, build representation? How do we build representation, right? How do we try to connect that discontent with actual political action, meaning, creation of political parties and so on and so forth. So
Well,
we see that in the
yes.
data, you know, and that's I guess the one of the main challenges of Chilean politics at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Sounds a little bit hint of the spontaneity that Patsy asked about. Well, we kept you longer than the plan, so thank you very, very much. María Inclán, who is here with us, but is in Mexico. She works in Mexico most of the time. Federico Rossi in Argentina, who will go back to Germany. And Sofía Donoso, who is in Chile. And felicitaciones, Sofía. Okay. She has expecting a wonderful bundle of joy. And thank you, Patsy, and Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies. And thank you, all of you who have stayed with us, all the participants. We started out with almost 40. We still have 12 here. So wonderful. Thank you. Let's give everybody a big clap.
Thank you.